Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, and greetings to everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Reflection Series webinar on Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus Approach in Conflict and Disaster Settings. I'm glad you could join. I know you're all busy and very much appreciate you joining us today to discuss this important topic for UNDP. As I just mentioned, there's been a lot of interest among member states on humanitarian development peace nexus issues, and they seek UNDP support for this. This webinar will be for 1 hour. There are 4 speakers today, after which there'll be a question answer. There'll be time for question answers and also to share your insights. Also, during the presentations and when speakers are sharing their insights, do feel free to put your questions or share your thoughts in the chat. We'll keep a tab on that. To begin with, it's my pleasure today to invite Isabel Mercier, the Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP, for opening remarks. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vijaya. And yes, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. And thank you for joining us in this latest installment of our Reflection series, where we present the most recurrent and valuable lessons today, of course, on an HDP Nexus. All of this work is coming from our evaluations. The hope is that as we pull these things together, that we could uncover new insights and apply them. So I'll launch right into my introduction, my very short introduction before we pass the floor on to the actual stars of the show. You may have noticed the message accompanying the invitation to this webinar, which is in 2024, there are still 300 million individuals living in protracted crises who need humanitarian assistance. So it's a big number, 300 million. It represents 4% of the global population. And while providing aid is so important for immediate relief and survival, as an international community, we need to do more to reduce this number in a more sustainable manner. We need to think about solutions that address root causes, that create humanitarian crises in the first place. And this is where the application of HDP Nexus concept is so important. Of course, we all know UNDP has a role to play in this, and it's deeply committed to operating in this space. This is why my office, in collaboration with the Crisis Bureau, decided to do some research and find out from past evaluations if there are any answers or lessons that can help UNDP enhance its approach and results. With the help of our Artificial Intelligence for Development Analytics tool, AIDA, we produced this reflections paper, which is now available on our website. It's available in 3 languages. It surfaces 7 lessons, some of which we'll unpack today. By sharing these insights, we really aim to have an open discussion and create a space for mutual knowledge sharing and inspiration. It's really important that if you want to participate, use the chat if you're too shy to raise your hand, but we really hope that after the presentation, you feel free to exchange and share examples and talk about your experience. These are supposed to be interactive sessions, and we can get into some quite rich discussions, so I'm looking forward to that. I wish to mention here that in the future, we'll explore a joint reflections paper with humanitarian and peace agencies on how the Nexus issue has been addressed more broadly in the UN system. This working paper will specifically focus on UNDP's role and contribution. And there are some examples that demonstrate synergies between recovery and development programs, but we recognize there's even more to unpack on this topic. So expect more from us in the future. A key lesson from the paper that'll be presented today, the key lessons will be presented by my colleague, Anna Kunova, who is a senior research analyst on my team, who co-authored this paper together with Axel Milino, who's on the screen. I'm also very pleased to welcome here Barbara Ann Krigsman, who is a senior policy advisor for policy coherence and integration in the Crisis Bureau, and Thayer Shrade, Deputy Resident Representative of In Transition, let's just say, formerly of Sudan. will provide his insights and remarks. So after the presentations, again, please, we invite you to share your thoughts, your ideas, good practices, and exchange with the speakers. So with that, Anna, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. In the next 10 minutes, I would like to share with you the key lessons from our latest reflection series paper on humanitarian development peace nexus approaches in conflict and disaster settings. So as it has been mentioned, these lessons have been synthesized from more than 60 evaluations, most of which have been carried out by the IEO or commissioned by the individual country offices. So what exactly do we mean by the humanitarian development peace nexus approach? This HDP nexus, or also triple nexus, is a way of working with populations affected by crisis to simultaneously reduce their humanitarian needs, address key root causes of the crisis, and decrease risks and vulnerabilities these populations face. To do so, the HDP Nexus strives to enhance the coordination, collaboration, and overall coherence of humanitarian development and peace actions. It is particularly relevant in protracted crisis and also in conflict and disaster settings in general. So UNDP has 3 roles within the Nexus. Firstly, it's acting as a bridge between humanitarian development and peace actors to catalyze system-wide coherence on the Nexus approach. Secondly, it's contributing to ending needs of populations in crisis by scaling up integrated programming. And thirdly, it's helping to develop financing strategies for Nexus approaches, which bring together various international, national, public, and private finance. So with this in mind, we had a look at the 60 plus relevant evaluations and formulated 7 lessons. 4 of them are rather general. They deal with UNDP partnerships and coordination with other actors, funding and ensuring localization lens in application of the Nexus. The other 3 lessons, lessons 5, 6, and 7, are more specific to the peace element of the HDP Nexus. And they deal with various ways to support peace and women's role in conflict resolution. Although this peace element is a crucial part of the HDP Nexus, we don't have time to go over all the lessons right now. So I decided to focus on the general lessons, and I would like to encourage you to have a look at the peace-oriented lessons in the paper. So in application of the HDP Nexus approach, UNDP has several advantages compared to other UN agencies, which relates, of course, to its broad mandate and experience. However, what our first lesson seeks to highlight here is the importance of strong partnerships with other UN agencies, international financial institutions, governments, civil society organizations, and local actors. The evaluative evidence shows that the biggest UNDP's achievements in application of the Nexus came from collaborating with partners. We found a lot of successful examples of this. For example, the Syrian regional refugee response, where UNDP closely worked, especially with UNHCR, or the Partnership for Recovery and Resilience in Avail State in South Sudan. We also found a good example of collaboration with national and local governments in Nigeria, where UNDP leveraged its trusted relationships with these institutions. Besides UN agencies and governments, the evaluative evidence we reviewed also highlights the need to work more with local actors, civil society organizations, and the private sector. The private sector has an extensive presence in conflict zones, and it can provide innovative solutions and also create employment opportunities. In some contexts, such as Sudan, Liberia, or the DRC, UNDP has successfully engaged it. But in others, such as Lake Chad Basin, this collaboration is yet to be emphasized. There is a need for caution in collaboration with private sector, especially regarding post-conflict action and the need to safeguard local markets. The second lesson I would like to talk about deals with coordination with UNDP's partners in a little more detail. What we saw in the evidence is that adapting existing coordination structures to align with Nexus principles at the country level is quite challenging. Sometimes the existing mechanisms rely heavily on humanitarian coordination structures and do not sufficiently involve other actors. At the same time, we also saw coordination models that were so complex that the evaluation stated that they are basically impeding the response. In the evaluations we reviewed, we didn't find any single way of coordination that would be universally effective across all contexts, but we found approaches that worked in certain settings and could be explored further. For example, in Cameroon, Somalia, DRC, and Sudan, UNDP and its partners form so-called Nexus task forces, which are strategic platforms for humanitarian development and peace-building actors to collaborate towards specific goals. Concretely in Somalia, UNDP was involved in Water and Flood Task Force, which brought together various stakeholders to develop a roadmap on flood response and identified opportunities on river management and flood mitigation. In the DRC and Sudan, there were similar initiatives, such as the Development and Reconstruction Facility. Another successful adaptation of a coordination mechanism we found in Lebanon and Sudan, where UNDP and its partners moved away from traditional so-called humanitarian clusters that put together actors responsible for emergency responses. The new mechanism was labeled post-cluster, and it created broader fora for a wider spectrum of actors and allowed for much more meaningful involvement of local authorities and other local stakeholders. Another promising coordination strategy is geographically focused planning, which is also known as area-based planning, which was used in Kenya, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. This approach addresses risks and needs comprehensively within specific communities or regions and allows for flexible responses. This leads me to the last lesson I would like to talk about today, which is lesson 4 in the paper and talks about localization efforts in application of the HDP Nexus. In the context of the Nexus, localization can be understood as a process of recognizing, respecting, and strengthening leadership by local and national authorities, and generally supporting their capacities to better address the needs of affected populations. Evaluation evidence shows that the localization processes build trust, social cohesion, and local ownership. They also influence individual and collective behavior to enable better conflict management. In the evaluations we reviewed, we found several successful strategies to ensure localization lands in the HDP Nexus application. For example, in Sudan, UNDP engaged traditional and customary institutions that have filled the vacuum in the absence of functioning state institutions in conflict-affected regions. Over time, these institutions became recognized by the government as structures for settling interpersonal and intergroup disputes and generally resolving conflicts through mediation. This contributed to strengthen social cohesion among conflicting groups. In some instances, UNDP was also able to leverage its territorial reach and program presence on the ground to ensure localization. For example, in Colombia, UNDP acted as a catalyst for other UN agencies that were seeking territorial presence as well. This improved local level coordination, not only among these UN agencies, but also among local stakeholders such as mayors, CSOs, the private sector, and displaced populations who were initially poorly linked among each other. And the last example I would like to mention is engaging local authorities and representatives of affected populations for consultations before the creation of the Nexus task force, which was documented in Cameroon and which increased relevance of the Nexus approach application. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. And apart from this paper, you can also check our website for our other papers in the reflection series, and stay tuned for our next webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Barbara, may I invite you now for your remarks?
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Let me first thank you very much for having been invited to participate in this panel. I think it's great to see that the Evaluation Office is looking at the HDP Nexus overall as an opportunity to advance the ambitions that UNEP has, especially in crisis and fragile countries. So I wanted to sort of build a little bit upon what Anna was saying, but also provide a little bit of context, right? Why is this important? Why do we need to reflect upon this? Why is it something that UNEP has been pushing and has been one of the organizations that has been pretty much at the forefront of the HDP Nexus from, its inception in 2016 World Humanitarian Summit? I think one of the first things that we can say is that, ultimately, I think we know, in UNEP, we know that development right now is the most viable means of prevention. It's an essential component of crisis response. And I think we also know that it's probably the most sustainable exit strategy for fragility in crisis. So, that means that we need to invest in development priorities earliest on in crisis situations. I think, as Isabel indicated earlier on, the current emerging development landscape is characterized by greater geopolitical divide. We have interconnected crisis. It's not just between countries; it's regional. There are new players, and obviously limited resources. And obviously, we can see. You just have to open your, BBC World News or Al Jazeera website to see the headlines and the toll that it has on the human lives. So when we are looking at how can we, as the UN system's biggest development agency, how do we navigate this? I think there's an increasing drive to really start looking at things from a risk-informed approach, making sure that we integrate risk perspective across all our programs, address pervasive threats and the opportunities that really are the ones that we need to trigger to have that structural transformation. And so when we're looking at that, we also need to understand that we need to work hand in hand with humanitarian response. And that means that, while you have our humanitarian colleagues doing the life-saving actions and support, we need to also come in as development actors to look at lasting solutions through, livelihoods engagements and provision of basic services. How do we really address these key risks? So let me give you an example. In the Arab states, we as UNEP have had a partnership with UNHCR that was part of the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, so the 3RP for the ones of you that are familiar. This was established because of the war in Syria and the outflow of Syrians in neighboring countries. Ultimately, this partnership with UNHCR, where UNHCR really comes in to look at the needs of refugees, and UNEP comes in from the much more development perspective of government engagement and capacities. We were able to create jobs for 500,000 Syrian refugees and host community members. We have been co-leading this 3RP. We brought together 270 partners. Anna mentioned partnerships being an important element. And from the UDP side, we really focused on the strengthening of the capacities of 40,000 civil servants across Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, so that the needs of the refugees could be met, as well as the ones from the host communities. And this is how these partnerships can really catalyze these principles of the Nexus, where immediate need of refugees, for example, or forced displaced people are being met, and we come in to ensure that governments are able to understand how to meet the needs of those people. I mean, another example we can look at is another UNDP and UNHCR partnership that spanned, countries like Colombia and DRC, Moldova, looked at a same perspective where it was looking at how can UNDP engage with state authorities and capacity development for systemic transformation, where UNHCR would come in and provide, tangibles, people-centered services to address, the justice problems of forced displacement. So I think it's important to understand that these are really sort of ways in which we can catalyze on our competitive advantage as UNDP, join up with, humanitarian partners to see where that complementarity meets in the middle, where both are, comparative advantage creates, this bigger, more positive impact over time. Another part of the equation that I would like to highlight is financing. And I think it's important to understand the difference between funding and financing. When we talk about financing, we generally speak of, how can we leverage these financing flows that come into countries that don't necessarily go through us or other multilaterals, but that are maybe bilaterally provided to the government, and how the government is then investing those in terms of the priorities in the country. Funding is much more related to grants. That's the money that we get. We get money to do projects and programs. That's mostly the funding part. But on financing, I think it's not a secret. All of us know, and especially the ones of you that are working in the field, that the financing is limited. The financing is limited on all sides. It's limited on the humanitarian side. It's limited on the development side. And so we need to collectively then re-envision what resourcing for prevention means. I think we need to have a better understanding of, what is a financing approach that can incentivize preventive, holistic, predictable, and coordinated support, and not one that will suddenly stop because uncertainty prevails, or a coup happens, or there's a sudden onset and suddenly all the attention goes either to the political process or to the humanitarian. So so what do we do about this? So in Ethiopia, for example, UNDP works with the Resident Coordinator's Office, where we're supporting these crisis-sensitive, what we call these integrated national financing frameworks. What does that mean? That means that we are looking at how do we leverage these sources of financing and aligning those with the priorities across the HDP Nexus. And in Ethiopia, this is looking at the priorities as per the 3-year development plan, the cessation of hostility agreements, and their disaster risk management strategy, so that we can make sure that we really address the needs across the HDP through public funds, through the government infrastructure. I'm wrapping up now, but as I'm wrapping up, I would like to sort of ask you to keep in mind in the Q&A the following things. As we reflect on the HDP Nexus and what it means, we need to keep the following in mind. So we need to make sure that we are bringing our solutions closer to the people that are affected. Anna already reflected on it, on the localization bit. We really need to see how do we ensure that the local populations are very much at the center of the decisions that are made with regards to how we get them out of fragility and out of crisis. When we are in the field and we go to a field visit, the communities don't care whether we're UNDP or we're OCHA or we're PBSO. They just want to have their needs met, and the label on our 4x4s really don't matter. So that means that we need to keep that in the back of our minds when we are, trying to devise our approaches and the collaboration, the complementarities that we're seeking out. The evidence base, and this is really sort of what this is about today. Establishing the evidence base, and this is why I'm so happy that the Evaluation Office is doing this. The evidence base for the HDP is incredibly important. We haven't cracked the nut just yet on how to really measure the impact of the HDP. The only thing that we know is that the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus is about diminishing humanitarian needs over time by investing more in those chronic deficits of development and those key risks and the vulnerabilities that are, catalyzers for these humanitarian needs. So, I mean, you could say that, if humanitarian needs are decreased, then, the Nexus being, efficient and has actually worked. But I think we need to go beyond that. We need to better sort of be able to monitor and evaluate the impact of the Nexus, and hopefully we can have a stronger opportunity with the evaluation to see how can we devise that. But today is a great start towards that. And then the last point is just, again, on financing. What are some of the opportunities that we need to look at in terms of ensuring that financing flows really sort of take into account the HDP spectrum and allow us to address these key risks and vulnerabilities. So let's keep that in mind as we open up the conversation. Handing over back to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for those insights and key principles of HDP and sharing those examples. We are lucky to have Tahir Shradher with us today to share what it means to implement HDP in a complex country context such as Sudan. Over to you, Tahir.
Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. I believe in this very important topic. Sudan was mentioned several times as part of the lessons in the report. So I will try just within those few minutes that I have to highlight three main points that I would like to share with you that might also explain or give another dimension to the lessons learned that we saw in the report. The first point I would like to share with you, colleagues, is about positioning UNDP and the concept of HDP Nexus in the context of a crisis, especially at the beginning of the crisis. It is not easy at all because of our mandate as a developmental agency. Usually with such strong crises like the one in Sudan, where we have more than 22 million people classified as in need, 9 million people refugees and IDPs, 15 million of people with food insecurity, and about 5 million that they are very close for a famine. Within such strong humanitarian context, usually it is hard to position UNDP and the HDP and make it on the table. I'm not sure about the audience, the colleagues who are in this meeting, but this is not my first crisis or post-crisis country that I served. Usually everybody within such strong crisis context, usually they are concentrating on life savings. People are just after, helping people, thinking that UNDP does not have a role. And usually such a thing makes it harder for us to play a role, or at least stay around the table until our role is clearer. This is something that, I would like to share with you. And this is why in Sudan, we created something called the crisis offer, like what UNDP Sudan is offering for the crisis, how we can help. Of course, we do not make the usual humanitarian assistance of food and NFI distribution, but we help with our specific interventions, our style of helping, that it is, I mean, even when we distribute NFIs, it is solar items that people can benefit from because of lack of electricity. What I wanted to say, especially with CPDs not being valid anymore in these kind of crisis, you need to create a kind of a strategic reference for your interventions. Even if it is a humanitarian saving, you try also to add the context of life sustaining in addition to life saving. And this is my first point in this regard. My second point is about unconstitutional change, and it depends on the crisis nature. But when it is combined with unconstitutional change in the country, it makes it harder also for us to work with our normal partners when it comes to peace and development. When I first arrived Sudan in September 2021, just a month later, the coup happened. And that affected all of the developmental programming and the developmental funding since then. But with the war breakout in April 2023, it adds to the complexity of having partners, usually from the government, to help them in conducting development and peace building. However, what we managed to do is made more partnerships with the civil society. Even we helped in creating what we called community management committees that can help us in developmental interventions plus peace building. But it is an important topic because it depends really on the nature of the crisis we are dealing with. Recently, I participated in a practice note that was conducted by UNDP in cooperation with the Crisis Bureau and the Governance and Peace Building Division at the regional hub, where I was advocating for, regardless of the unconstitutional change that might happen, we need to maintain a relationship at the technical level with the government's technical department if we want to really make an impact at the national side, especially when it comes to sectors like health, for example, or education. We cannot, and this is something that we need also to educate the donors about. We cannot just cut all of our ties with the government. We need to maintain that kind of technical relationship that we can really make an impact at the national level. And my final point, actually, which it is something also that we learned from this crisis in specific in Sudan, is that we really need to build our argument, especially for the HDP. And the way I think UNDP can make the argument, and we are very good in that, is this kind of analysis that we make. Usually, we are unique with this kind of analysis and assessments from other UN agencies, providing knowledge products about the situation of the crisis. So what we did in Sudan, we made a socioeconomic impact assessment on Sudan for the impact of the war on Sudan. And through that assessments, we provide the big picture. And this is where I I encourage other country offices with similar situations is to come with this kind of analysis that gives the bigger picture of the crisis. This SIA or socio-economic impact assessment, currently we have finished it for the impact of the war on livelihoods for the rural areas, which it is about 66% of the population in Sudan. But it will be also will continue with covering the livelihoods in urban areas and MSMEs also in Sudan. But this kind of assessments actually makes your argument for the how important the HDP nexus, because you are analyzing what is really happening in the country, in addition to the numbers that the humanitarian actors always refer to, the number of refugees, IDPs, the people in need, etc. But also such kind of analysis and assessments gives the idea about what is happening with the economy, what is happening with the currency, what is happening with the livelihoods. One of the most interesting parts that we came up out of this year is indicating, by the way, yes, there are about 15 million, more than 15 million with food insecurity, and 5 million are about to have a famine. But lots of the people who are also having food insecurity, it is not because of the lack of food, but it is also because of the weak purchasing power of the food that it is happening. And this is your entrance for that the HDP needs to apply, especially with a huge crisis where the volume is obviously huge, and Sudan is, I think, described as the biggest humanitarian crisis in the current time. But with such big crisis, you cannot really respond to it through a simplified humanitarian response. We do not have the capacity, nobody has the capacity to respond to all of these people in need. And this is where our argument was that we need to make developmental interventions that can help and support the livelihoods, the economy, getting even, getting into partnerships with the private sector, that they can even enhance the access to hard currencies, because it is also affecting the local currency and the pricing of food and necessary goods. And this kind of understanding of the bigger picture, it helps the donors, even the humanitarian actors, to realize that with the crisis, the answer is not only about life saving or a simplified humanitarian response by giving food baskets and NFIs. It needs to have another dimension of interventions, including, civil society, including private sector, that we all, with all of these interventions, we can respond to the crisis. Otherwise, we will fail to respond to all of this huge number of beneficiaries. And I just wanted to conclude by saying, when the Paris Humanitarian Conference in Sudan took place in Paris, at the beginning we were not really invited for the conference. And this is why we rushed the launching of this socioeconomic impact assessment. I have done it in Brussels, inviting the French government for it, which made us secure a seat in the Paris conference, because actually they started to understand that HDP, the UNDP way of thinking and interventions It is not really a luxury thing or something that can happen later. It should be part of our dealing with the crisis, and therefore actually we were invited for the Paris conference. I hope those 3 points I mean added to the lessons learned that was presented by thanks colleagues. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Tahir, for bringing in those important insights. It seems like what we learned from 3RP, we are repeating all over again in the case of Sudan refugee crisis. Exactly same thing happened for 3RP. UNDP was not at the table, but had to make its point and get to the table when Syrian refugee response was discussed. Thanks so much for reminding also about the political transition, political challenges as well, which is so fundamental in most of the conflict context. Just before I open the floor for questions and sharing insights, just would like to flag a couple of emerging questions. One was on financing for development in the conflict context, which Barbara highlighted, which also the reflections paper talks about. Any questions or insights on that would be very helpful. And also, there is limited evaluative evidence on the area-based approaches. You may all recall that UNDP championed area-based programming in conflict context 2 decades back. And increasingly, it's recognized that area-based programming can be a tool for implementing Nexus programs. And we did not find much evaluative evidence on that. Any insights, colleagues who joined today, please do share. Tahir did talk about the lessons from the 3RP, the Syrian refugee response, and also Barbara mentioned about it. What do you think about post 3RP? How much of these lessons we are using to apply when we are talking about HDP programming, just not in Arab states and in Ukraine, but also in Sahel, where it's also critical, where UNDP has been doing some work in terms of establishing platforms. And lastly, as our director mentioned, some of the examples that are presented in the reflection paper show the possibilities, but may not exactly be what HDPN programming implies. So you need to take that in that spirit. With that, I would like to open the floor for discussion. There are already a couple of questions from Sri Lata. There were 2 questions, one on methodology for selecting this evaluation, as well as whether the HDPN was intentional in these programs which were synthesized. And there's also a question from Mona Fatou on balancing, on ensuring national ownership and balancing programming at a different level while maintaining the humanitarian principles. Sri Lata, Mona, you can come in as well, but these are the questions for Anna, Axel, and Barbara.
Okay, so I can start probably with the methodological question. We used the artificial intelligence for development analysis, IDA. I think that the link should be in the chat. It's our analysis tool that basically allows us to explore the wealth of evaluations that we have. It's more than 6,000 evaluations from either done by the IEO or commissioned at the country level, and using keywords such as not only the HDP Nexus, but also conflict, disaster, and more specific keywords. We found it was more than 100 of evaluations, which we then screened like in en vivo to see whether they are really relevant and whether they include explicit reference to HDP Nexus. We had a discussions initially at the like starting the analysis for the paper whether we should include only the papers that explicitly aim to implement the Nexus approach, or whether we would basically be looking at attempts for coordination and coherence between humanitarian development and peace actors in general without specific reference to the Nexus, but we decided to have it closely related, which also, I guess, answers the second question. So basically all the evaluations we reviewed were from interventions or programs that are intentionally, explicitly attempting to implement the Nexus approach.
Thank you, Anna. Srilata, would you like to come in?
No, thank you. That was very helpful. It's good to know the extent of work that you have done, and also that you were actually picking up programs that had intentional, like the Triple Nexus integrated into the program design, because sometimes it's difficult when you come after the fact and try to find that evidence when it was not thought through right in the beginning. So I think that really helps. Yeah, thank you.
Mona, would you can you please Iben unmute Mona if she has trouble with the. Mona had a question on lessons on balancing different levels of programming as well as ensuring national ownership while maintaining the humanitarian principles. Yes, Mona is there.
Hi, Vijaya. No, thank you, colleagues. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. It was just a question that Tyre had actually touched on and we face in Ukraine, and I think is quite common in a lot of Nexus scenarios where we're working within a context where the government is often a party to the conflict. We need to be maintaining humanitarian principles in the humanitarian response, including independence, neutrality, but at the same time, having to balance working closely with government at both national and local levels, especially from a Nexus standpoint, in order to move more toward a system strengthening approach in later recovery phases. So we were just wondering, because this is something that I think many of us in these types of contexts struggle with, if the evaluations had any lessons learned on that balance. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, Axel, would you like to come in? I can also respond to Mona's question afterwards.
And hi, Barbara.
And Barbara, please.
Yes. Hi, Mona.
Yeah, Axel.
Always good to see you. Can I come in on this question?
Sure, Barbara.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Yeah, Mona, thanks for raising this, and good to see you. You're still in Ukraine. We're due catch up. Okay, listen. And it would be good to also hear from Tyre, obviously, in terms of his perspective on that. I think that it needs to be clear that I think that the Nexus is not compromising humanitarian principles, right? It's a way of working, and it's a way in which humanitarian development peace actors work in complementarity with one another. So that doesn't mean that humanitarian actors have to then compromise humanitarian principles. I think that, since you're with UNICEF, Mona, as a double-mandated agency, UNICEF has been able to find a way to navigate having this dual mandate and seeing where there is the need to really put forward humanitarian principles and where those can be where situations where this is less necessary, let's put it this way. I don't think, and especially when you're dual mandated, that there are instances where humanitarian principles have to be compromised. It's, at the end of the day, I think the reality is that we all work in countries where the government has the final say. And it doesn't matter then if you're humanitarian, development, or peace. The country doesn't agree, the government doesn't agree with what you're doing. It doesn't matter under which label you put yourself. You still have to then ultimately do what the government wants you to do. So that's this thing is when I was also providing these examples of how you can work in complementarity with one another. For us, for example, the examples I put forward is, partnership with HCR allows us to, as UNDP, work with the government and the capacity of government to address the specific needs of forced displaced populations that have these specific either, regulatory needs or specific, administrative needs that need to be met. And so depending on the situation, I think it's safe to say that there's a general understanding that the Nexus does not compromise humanitarian principles, that you can still keep the local and national ownership as an important premise of the engagements, especially on the development side. But I think that on the humanitarian side, we often have to do this because you see increasingly in HRPs and humanitarian actors working with local government often, and also central government, to promote certain approaches or priorities that need to be put forward to address the needs of the general populations. So I think the Nexus principles and humanitarian principles can very much live side by side without compromising, especially the humanitarian principles. But maybe it would be good to hear from Thayer, because I know that he raised the issue as well. Over from my end.
Thayer, would you like to come in? Thayer Frozen. Hi, Thayer, you can come in. I think maybe lessons from Sudan would be important. While Thayer comes in, I think this is, thanks, Barbara, for clarifying. It's a misconception that HDP means humanitarian principles are compromised. No, humanitarian programming can happen simultaneously. Not all elements of humanitarian program can come into link to DNP. There are only some elements of it, so all of it can happen parallel. That's why I would like to remind colleagues who are not familiar with 3RP to take a look at that, because 3RP gave all of us, not only UNDP as a largest development agency, but also the humanitarian actors and the peace actors, important lessons on the need for collaborating and working together to address some of the issues like financing, some of the challenges of the sensitivities of humanitarian programming, and also simultaneously carrying out the development programming. I think it's a practical example of how Nexus was applied at the agencies level. Everybody committed to it. So just to further emphasize what Barbara has already shared. Thayer, would you like to come in on that to share insights from Sudan?
Thanks, and I apologize. It seems to be I had unstable connectivity, so I lost your colleagues for a while. However, I mean, if I understood the essence of the question, and from also what Barbara was mentioning, absolutely, the humanitarian principles, I mean, I don't think they should be compromised, and the HDP actually supports that. In fact, we have a partnership with UNHCR, for example, on durable solution, which it is a global partnership, and we have it in specific, for example, in Sudan. And I think the humanitarian actors can benefit from the developmental actors who are, in touch with the government and can, make a positive influence in facilitating the humanitarian response. And in all cases, I believe, like the situation in Sudan and Iraq, for example, where we have a political mission, in addition to the humanitarian coordination bodies like OCHA and the cluster coordination structure. All of that should support the idea of that all of the principles should be supported. The political mission in Sudan, the political mission in, I mean, it is over in Sudan. I mean, it's transitioned out, and it is in the way also for Iraq. And most of these, the roles and the functions that were conducted by UNITAMs in Sudan, actually, we were approached as UNDP to take to carry on with those functions about mediation, about political analysis, which means that developmental actors are really helping the humanitarian response when possible through the networks that the developmental actors already created with the local authorities or with the government.
Thank you so much, Tahir. And Mona, just before I go to Axel, I think Sudan gives us so many examples where how colleagues like Tahir worked there, even when there was an embargo, to work with elements of the government, when also government was a party to the conflict. They worked with certain institutions in the government to ensure development happened, because we are talking about 2 decades of conflict there, and we cannot stop development all that long, right? They're into 3rd decade there. So I think this has to continue. And I think even in UNDP's program, there are quite a few examples how colleagues in the country offices navigated that space to ensure humanitarian happened while concrete development initiatives went on. Axel, sorry for coming to you late.
No problem, no problem. Thank you very much. No, just to add a few things about the challenge, to keep to keep the balance, the right balance between the Nexus and following the humanitarian principle. So first of all, the HDP Nexus approach is limited by in some contexts. An open and active conflict, it's quite difficult to think of sustainable solution. It's difficult to implement Nexus approach when we are still in an active conflict, as it can be the case in Ukraine. Now, when it comes to the peace component, I think that we have to understand the word peace in a broad sense, not in the idea of interrupting or stopping a conflict, but it's more how to ensure a more stable environment for the different communities, how to decrease tension among communities. I'm going to give you the example of you can have an attack or a conflict or a natural disaster, and it leads to a massive displacement. In this case, these massive displacements will create tension among the communities, and this is where we can work on the peace component. But and this is where we can actually respect the humanitarian principles. But I would say that all red lines will be drawn according to the context, according to the countries. But I would say that as long as we deal with humanitarian support, needs, assistance, objectives, then we will respect humanitarian principles. When it comes to follow a political agenda, like involving in a ceasefire, for example, negotiating with party to the armed conflict, then this is where it can be tricky, and this is where you will see the humanitarian actor that will withdraw because they don't want to get involved in political or military agenda. But yeah, beside this, I think that the peace component should be seen in a broad sense. Over for me.
Thank you so much, Axel, for clarifying that. Niels, do you would like to come in? Do you have a question? I don't see Niels. Iben, can you please unmute Niels? Any last questions, colleagues, before we close today's discussion? I don't see Niels coming up. Isabel, would you like to say a few words? Yeah, Niels.
Niels just joined.
Niels, do you have a question?
No, I did not. I think actually it was Barbara that pointed out my name, but I'm very, very happy to be here, and greetings from Kiev. It's been a very interesting discussion for me to join as well. Just very quickly, I manage a large recovery program for the Eastern South in this current situation. So I particularly can second the whole thing about localization. We've been able to do a lot of work in the current context. I don't think I have to tell colleagues what's going on in Ukraine. We're working with the local authorities and setting up different coordination platforms. We're helping with creating, access to social services. We're working a lot with civil society to make sure they're doing their work, and also security providers. So I think these recommendations you found, I saw a lot of interesting things there. I would also say, and again, there's not enough time for that, but I had practical experience of being 2 years in the East, in Dnipro, where most of the humanitarian actors are. There's also a lot of lessons in applying the Nexus, which I have to say it's not easy, even when you're there with other colleagues. And I think we've still seen this, and maybe a takeaway is that I think Ukraine is one of those places we should be able to. It's really a development. I mean, one looks out the window, we're in a development context here, and it's what the government wants. So there's still some challenges ahead. I would be very happy to contribute to that in a second row of this, but Barbara also knows it very well. She knows the colleagues here. We would very much like to see some of those comments go in, and then hopefully for the next time we would be even better prepared because we all very much would like to see Nexus, in practice and as best as possible. So just a few reflections from mine, and great to see colleagues here. Over.
Thanks so much, Niels. And I would like to also thank Tanya for sharing some, a lessons paper on area-based approaches. Thanks, Tanya. Just before I pass it on to Isabel for a last remarks, there's a survey. We have posted it in the chat. Colleagues, it takes only a few seconds. Please take a few moments to respond to the survey, which helps us to further improve the webinars of the reflection series. And over to you, Isabel.
Well, we're already a little late. I want to thank everyone for joining, and of course, I want to thank our speakers. I very much appreciated the discussion, and yes, thank you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Bye-bye. Bye, Axel.